Hey guys, tonight we're heading back, way, way back, to a world where the morning commute involved a river, a hoe, and a prayer to a cat goddess that your crops didn't drown again. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a drink of water, preferably not straight from the Nile, and let's drift into the life of an Egyptian farmer around, say, 2500 BCE. This was long before pyramids were tourist traps, before Cleopatra turned eyeliner into a diplomatic weapon, and before anyone in the Mediterranean thought bathing might be a decent idea. Back then, Egypt wasn't just a kingdom. It was a very long, very narrow strip of mud held together by faith, grain, and the occasional divine decree. And in the middle of it all were the farmers, ordinary people, the literal backbone of the world's first stable civilization, which is kind of ironic because their lives were anything but stable. Let's start with mornings. If you were an Egyptian farmer, your alarm clock was the Nile. Not a gentle sunrise or the soft crow of a rooster, no. It was the gurgling reminder that the entire reason you exist is to dig ditches before the floodwaters ruin everything you worked for. Every year, between June and September, the Nile would swell and flood its banks. The Egyptians called it Akhet, the season of inundation. Everyone else would call it, oh great, here comes the mud again. But this mud, black, rich, fertile, was Egypt's lifeline. Without it, Egypt was just a fancy desert with commitment issues. The flood deposited silt across the valley, making the soil ready for another round of barley and emmer wheat. So when the water rose, life sort of paused. You couldn't plant, you couldn't harvest, you just waited, like your entire existence depended on a river having good mood swings. During the flood months, the government, which is a polite way of saying whoever the pharaoh liked this decade, would often recruit farmers for labor projects. And recruit here meant you don't really get to say no. You might get sent to build temples, or dig irrigation canals, or drag massive limestone blocks for a nobleman's tomb. You'd be paid in food, beer, and the comforting thought that your spirit might get a small karmic upgrade in the afterlife. And yes, beer. Egyptian farmers drank beer the way we drink water. Mostly because their water was beer. It was thick, soupy, and about as alcoholic as a modern kombucha, so don't picture frat parties. Picture hydration with mild flavor and nutritional regret. Let's float back to the fields. When the floodwaters receded, that's when the real work began. Picture it, a warm morning, the Nile glinting like liquid bronze, palm trees swaying lazily, and you, ankle-deep in mud, trying to convince your cow not to eat your plow. Most plows were wooden and dragged by oxen. Simple tools, but incredibly effective. You'd walk behind, guiding the ox, muttering prayers to whichever god was listening, usually Osiris, because he handled crops, death, and, apparently, overworked farmers. Once the land was tilled, it was time to sow seeds. Men walked with baskets, tossing handfuls of barley and wheat like they were feeding pigeons, while women and children followed behind, trampling the seeds into the earth. It was a family business, whether you liked it or not. And if you didn't like it, well, tough. Ancient Egypt didn't really have a career change option. You were born a farmer, you died a farmer. And if you were very lucky, your son might one day be, also a farmer. Social mobility was a bit of a desert mirage. Lunch, let's talk about that. After hours under the brutal sun, you'd take a break. You'd probably find a patch of shade near a date palm, unwrap some bread, Dense, gritty stuff full of bits of sand because ancient grinding stones weren't exactly precision tools, and wash it down with more beer. Maybe you'd have onions, lentils, or fish from the Nile if you'd done well that week. And yes, fish. The Egyptians adored fish. They salted it, dried it, and sometimes worshipped it, depending on which god was currently trending. Family life was practical. Most farmers lived in small mud brick houses with flat roofs. Inside it was simple. 1 or 2 rooms, a few reed mats, some pottery jars, maybe a tiny household shrine. The walls weren't painted white like in movies. They were mud-colored because they were, made of mud. At night, the roof doubled as your air-conditioned lounge. The desert got cold after sunset, so families would often sleep on the roof to escape the heat and insects. There was no Netflix, but you had stars, thousands of them, glittering over a river that looked eternal. Children helped from a young age. Boys learned to plow and fish. Girls learned to grind grain, fetch water, and manage the home. Childhood was short because survival didn't really allow for adolescence. Still, Egyptians loved their kids. We find little clay toys, carved animals, and balls of papyrus fiber. Even in a civilization obsessed with death, they made room for play. Speaking of death, because this is Egypt and you can't go 5 minutes without it, farmers were deeply spiritual. Every season, every harvest, every plague of frogs had divine meaning. You might start your morning with a quick offering, a few grains, a drop of beer, to ensure the gods didn't smite your crops out of boredom. The gods were everywhere, in the river, in the sky, in the cats prowling your granary. Cats, by the way, were not pets. They were sacred pest control. Let one die accidentally, and you might find yourself on the wrong side of divine customer service. And when death finally came, as it did, early and often, the average farmer couldn't afford a pyramid. You got a simple burial in the desert, wrapped in linen, maybe with a few amulets or a loaf of bread to snack on in the afterlife. If you were really lucky, someone might paint your name on the coffin. If not, well, the gods would figure it out. Probably. Taxons were the true divine punishment. Everything belonged to the pharaoh. Technically a living god, but more accurately the CEO of an agrarian monopoly. You farmed his land, using his water, growing his crops, and then gave a big chunk of your harvest back to him in the form of taxes. Scribes came around to measure your fields, check your yield, and collect grain. You couldn't really argue with them because the guy behind them was holding a stick. If you didn't have enough grain to pay, they took your livestock, or tools, or in extreme cases, your dignity. Egyptians might have invented writing, but they also invented bureaucratic misery. Still, for all the hardship, there was a rhythm. The Nile rose and fell, the fields grew and emptied, and the same families worked the same land for generations. There was beauty in that predictability, a kind of quiet endurance. Farmers might have had little, but they were the reason Egypt thrived. The pyramids didn't build themselves, the temples didn't feed their priests, the pharaoh didn't harvest his own grain, though imagining that is mildly entertaining. And despite being at the bottom of the social ladder, Egyptian farmers were respected in their way. Tomb paintings show them at work, not as slaves, but as vital gears in the cosmic machine. The Egyptians believed that keeping Ma'at, the balance of the world, required everyone to play their part, even if your part involved pulling weeds while getting sunburned into oblivion. Let's drift ahead to evening. The sun sets, the air cools, and the fields turn gold. The oxen are tied up, tools are stacked, and families return home. Dinner was modest. More bread, lentils, maybe vegetables or fish. The family gathered on the floor, chatting softly. maybe listening to a traveling storyteller if one wandered through the village. Oil lamps flickered, casting shadows on mud brick walls. The night was quiet, except for crickets and the distant murmur of the river. Life was hard, painfully so, but it was steady. You knew when to sow, when to harvest, when to offer prayers. You knew your place in the grand divine order. There was comfort in that kind of certainty, even if it came wrapped in dust and debt. And that's the strange paradox of the Egyptian farmer. He lived on the edge of disaster, yet built the foundation of eternity. His fields fed the temples, his taxes built the monuments, and his sweat sustained the gods themselves. He had no power, no luxury, and no voice, yet his labor carved a civilization that still fascinates us 5,000 years later. Not bad for a guy whose biggest daily problem was whether the ox would behave. Let's drift onward, because next we'll wade into the social web of Egyptian villages, their gossip, their festivals, and their occasional mid-harvest meltdowns. But for now, just let the Nile's rhythm carry you, slow and endless, into the next part. Hey again, wanderer of ancient dreams. If you're still awake, congratulations! You've survived one full day in ancient Egypt, sunburned, underpaid, and ankle-deep in sacred mud. But tonight, let's wander back into the village. Because being a farmer in ancient Egypt wasn't just about crops and floods, it was about community, gossip, rituals, and trying to survive under the watchful eyes of gods and bureaucrats. Lots of bureaucrats. Always watching, always counting. So, picture this. A cluster of low mud brick houses, maybe a few dozen at most, huddled together near the riverbank. Smoke from cooking fires drifts lazily into the dusk. Chickens wander freely, a few goats argue in the background, and a kid runs by chasing a dog with a stick that's definitely not regulation safe. Welcome to an Egyptian village, circa 1500 BCE. It's not glamorous, but it's home. There's no town hall, no real mayor, just a local headman, usually someone who owned more land or had friends among the scribes. You might think of him as the unofficial manager of everyone else's misfortunes. If someone stole your donkey or borrowed your hoe and forgot to return it, you didn't exactly call the police. You went to this headman, who then, maybe if he was in a good mood, talked to the local scribe. And scribes? Ah yes, the true power players of ancient Egypt. They were the ones who could write, which meant they could record taxes, measure land, and, most importantly, make your life complicated with papyrus paperwork. They strutted through villages with reed pens tucked behind their ears like rock stars of the Bronze Age. And since hardly anyone else could read, whatever they wrote down was, quite literally, law. So, if a scribe said you owed 20 sacks of barley, you owed 20 sacks of barley, even if your field only produced 15. Math in ancient Egypt was not a democratic process. But let's not get too cynical. There was warmth here too, the kind that comes from shared struggle. Neighbors helped each other repair irrigation dikes after floods. Families gathered for meals, weddings, and religious festivals. Children played in the dust while their mothers gossiped, mostly about whose husband hadn't shown up from canal duty and who might be secretly hoarding onions. Onions were a big deal. Sacred to the gods, yes, but also just really tasty in a diet that was otherwise bread, beer, and mild despair. Now, let's talk fashion, because even a farmer needed style. Men wore short linen kilts called shendit, basically the Bronze Age version of a wrap skirt. Women wore simple sheath dresses held up by straps. Linen was light, perfect for the heat, and usually off-white, unless you were feeling fancy and could afford dye. And no, they didn't walk around filthy all the time. Egyptians were borderline obsessed with cleanliness. They bathed frequently, not for luxury, but because hygiene was basically a religious act. Dirt and disease were seen as forms of spiritual impurity. Soap? Not quite. They used a mix of animal fat and natron, a naturally occurring soda ash that also doubled as a body scrub, and, charmingly, a mummification ingredient. Efficiency was everything. Most people went barefoot, though you might slip on papyrus sandals for special occasions, like temple festivals or tax audits. Hair was another matter. Men often shaved their heads to stay cool and avoid lice. Women kept theirs longer, but tied it up neatly, sometimes covering it with a wig. The rich had elaborate wigs. Farmers, simple ones, or none at all. And yes, they used scented oils, because even if you were poor, you could still smell divine. Now, about those festivals. Even in the backwater villages, life wasn't all toil and taxes. Egyptians loved festivals. And thankfully, the gods provided plenty of excuses. There were festivals for planting, festivals for harvest, festivals for the river rising, and sometimes even festivals for the river not rising, which were significantly less cheerful. The biggest ones were tied to major deities, Osiris, Isis, Hathor, and Ra, and were marked by processions, music, feasting, and yes, a bit of drunken joy. Imagine a line of villagers following a statue of a god down the riverbank, singing hymns while playing rattles and flutes. Kids run around with palm branches, women dance, and the local priest pretends he's already tipsy from ritual wine. For one day, the farmer wasn't a laborer. He was part of a divine celebration, a reminder that life, though harsh, had meaning. And since ancient Egyptian religion blurred the line between daily chores and divine duty, even your harvest was a sacred act. When you reaped your grain, you were participating in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, symbolic of Osiris himself. Now, speaking of cycles, let's talk about marriage. Farmers didn't have elaborate weddings. No long ceremonies, no scrolls signed in gold ink. Marriage was more like a mutual agreement. We live together now. We share food. Congratulations, we're married. There were no priests involved, no temples needed. Just two families, maybe an exchange of gifts, usually something practical, like grain or livestock, and that was it. But don't mistake simplicity for lack of affection. Love poems survive on scraps of papyrus, full of longing and charm. My heart flutters when I see you, like a bird who has found its nest. Not bad for 3,000 years before Valentine's Day. Marriage was mostly monogamous, though men of means sometimes had more than one wife or concubine. Divorce was common and surprisingly fair. A woman could leave her husband, take her dowry, and go, which, in a society that built pyramids for dead kings, was a shockingly progressive move. Education, on the other hand, was limited. Most farmers couldn't read or write. Their kids didn't go to school, unless one somehow got noticed by a scribe or priest, which was about as likely as your cow learning geometry. But practical skills? Those they learned early. How to dig irrigation ditches, how to thresh grain, how to tell when the flood was coming by watching the river level and the stars. Egyptians were keen observers of nature. They could predict the flood's arrival with eerie accuracy. No apps, no satellites, just the rhythm of the world. And when the stars of Sirius, the bright dog star, appeared before dawn, they knew the Nile was coming. Time to prepare. Let's pause and talk about religion again, because honestly, in ancient Egypt, you couldn't not talk about it. Everything, and I mean everything, was divine. The rising of the sun was Ra's daily commute across the sky. The flood was Hapi, god of the Nile, doing his annual performance review. Even your sick cow probably offended a minor deity somewhere. Each village had its local god, its patron spirit. Maybe it was a falcon, a crocodile, or a strange hybrid of both. People built small shrines in their homes, offered bread, beer, and incense. The goal wasn't just worship, it was balance, maintaining Ma'at, truth, order, and harmony. Because if Ma'at broke down, if people lied, cheated, or failed their duties, chaos, Iset, could take over. And nobody wanted that, not after last year's locust problem. Now, let's talk about women. Compared to many other ancient cultures, Egyptian women had it remarkably good. They could own property, run businesses, go to court, and even inherit wealth. A farmer's wife might manage the household finances, trade goods in the local market, and make offerings to the gods, all without needing permission from her husband. Her workload, though, was crushing. She ground grain, baked bread, brewed beer, fetched water, spun linen, and raised children. Basically, the unofficial minister of everything. Still, her role carried dignity. In Egyptian art, men and women often appear side by side, the same size, symbolizing equality, which was probably the artist's polite way of saying, she's the one who actually keeps things running. Now let's drift toward the fields again, but this time to the harvest. When the crops were ready, the entire village came alive. Harvesting was done by hand with sickles, curved blades inset with flint. It was hard work, but communal. Men cut the grain, women gathered and tied the sheaves, children helped carry them home. Songs filled the air, rhythmic, steady, meant to keep time and spirits high. Once the grain was threshed and winnowed, part of it went to the household, part to taxes, and part to storage for future planting. The rest was stored in clay silos, sealed tight against pests and humidity, or as tight as you could manage before a family of rats found religion inside your grain bin. The year followed a sacred rhythm. Akhet, the flood season, inundation. Peret, the growing season. Shemu, the harvest season. 3 parts, repeating endlessly. Life, growth, and renewal, the heartbeat of Egypt. Even time itself flowed like the Nile, cyclical, eternal, serene. And yet, beneath that calm, there was anxiety. Too much flood, your crops drowned. Too little, famine. The gods were moody, the bureaucracy unforgiving, and your livelihood depended on the whims of a river and a celestial dog star. But Egyptians endured. They adapted. They built dikes, canals, storage systems, and a whole worldview designed to make sense of uncertainty. They believed death wasn't an end, but a transition. Life was just one chapter in an eternal story. And perhaps that belief, that quiet confidence, was what let them endure thousands of years without breaking. When night came, the village hushed. The fires dimmed, the air cooled, and the stars emerged over the black ribbon of the Nile. Somewhere, a scribe was still scratching notes on a piece of limestone. Somewhere else, a farmer whispered a prayer of thanks for another day of survival. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a full one, rich in ritual, community, and meaning. And as the night breeze brushed over the riverbanks, the hum of insects mixing with the soft lap of water, the people of Egypt slept, not dreaming of wealth, but of balance, of Ma'at, the same dream that built an empire. Let's drift to part 3 next, where we'll wander through the darker side of the Nile life. Taxes gone wrong, famines, and the occasional divine bureaucratic meltdown. Hey there, still awake? Impressive. By now, you've farmed, prayed, gossiped, and somehow survived another day under the Egyptian sun. But don't get too comfortable, because even in the afterlife of ancient bureaucracy, someone always wants your grain. Yes, it's time to talk about taxes. Not the modern kind with accountants and emails, no, the original hand-carved in stone type of taxes, the kind that made entire civilizations sigh deeply into their clay cups of barley beer. Let's start with the basics. In ancient Egypt, technically everything, and I mean everything, belonged to the pharaoh. Your land? Pharaohs. Your crops? Pharaohs. Your donkeys? Pharaohs. But you can borrow them. Even your spare sandals? Probably Pharaoh's too, if he really wanted them. This wasn't greed so much as cosmic order. Pharaoh was seen as the divine link between gods and people, the living embodiment of Ma'at, balance and truth. So if you used Pharaoh's land, which you did, it only made sense that you gave him a share of your harvest. That share, by the way, was collected by the tax officials, a group of men known for their unwavering commitment to fairness, accuracy, and... No, I'm kidding. They were as corrupt as a mud brick left in floodwater. Picture this scene. The harvest is over, the sun is brutal, and here come the scribes and tax collectors, maybe 5 or 6 of them, in fine linen kilts, holding measuring ropes and scrolls. They walk through your field, squinting at the grain, doing complex math that you, conveniently, aren't allowed to double-check. Then one of them makes a note on papyrus, a record of what you owe. If you can't pay, no problem. They'll take your livestock, or your tools, or if you're really unlucky, your freedom. There's actually a painting from an ancient tomb showing this process in loving detail. You can see the farmers delivering sacks of grain, while scribes sit smugly nearby recording every sack. In one corner, a man gets beaten for underpaying. You know, just to really drive home the fun of fiscal responsibility. Taxes weren't just on crops. You could be taxed for fishing, for herding, for brewing beer. Even honey had a tax, which frankly feels like an insult to the bees. And let's not forget labor taxes, the state's favorite loophole. Instead of money, you could be invited to work on royal projects, temples, canals, tombs, pyramids. It was called corvée labor, a fancy term meaning, congratulations, you're building a monument now. You didn't get paid, though you might receive rations, beer, and the satisfaction of knowing your sweat was helping immortalize someone else's ego in limestone. Pharaohs loved that arrangement, the ultimate subscription model. You work for them, and they reward you with barley bread and mild back pain. Now, let's imagine what happens when things go wrong. Maybe the Nile doesn't flood properly. The water's too low, the fields dry up, and your grain shrivels. Suddenly, there's not enough food, not for your family, not for the temple, not even for Pharaoh's royal granaries. What happens next? That's right, famine. Famine in ancient Egypt wasn't just hunger. It was cosmic disorder. The gods were angry, Ma'at was broken, and every priest in the land was burning extra incense trying to figure out whose fault it was. In reality, of course, it was just the unpredictable Nile. But religion gave it meaning, and bureaucracy gave it paperwork. The state kept records of these disasters. There's a famous inscription called the Famine Stela, carved centuries later, describing a 7-year famine during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser. According to the story, the priests consulted records, found the problem, the god Khnum was angry because his temple had been neglected, and after a few ritual repairs, and I assume generous donations, the floods returned. It's a very Egyptian solution. Identify divine neglect, issue repairs, and move on. But while the priests and pharaohs negotiated with gods, the farmers had to survive. During bad years, they ate whatever they could: lotus roots, fish, even locusts. Some sold possessions, others borrowed grain from state granaries, at interest, of course. Yes, the first recorded loan sharks may well have been Egyptian scribes with fancy reed pens. Debt could last generations. A bad flood year could trap families in permanent poverty. But they rarely revolted, not openly. Egyptians were masters of endurance. Quiet survival, not rebellion, was their superpower. And yet, every so often, the system cracked. There are papyri from the Middle Kingdom describing village complaints, entire communities writing to officials about corruption, theft, or abusive overseers. These weren't revolutions. They were polite protests written in beautiful cursive, probably sealed with a prayer that someone, somewhere, might actually care. Now, let's float away from misery for a bit, to the world of record-keeping. Egyptian bureaucracy was mind-bendingly detailed. Every sack of grain, every jug of oil, every shipment of papyrus, documented, logged, stored. The ancient Egyptians loved lists. Lists of workers, lists of offerings, lists of lists. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were administrative hubs, like a divine combination of IRS and post office. Priests weren't just chanting hymns, they were balancing ledgers. You could say religion in Egypt was a full-time civil service job with bonus spiritual benefits. Speaking of temples, let's talk about how they actually ran the economy. The temple estates were massive. They owned fields, livestock, workshops, even fleets of boats. Farmers worked temple land, scribes tracked harvests, and priests redistributed goods. In return, the gods received offerings, daily meals, incense, beer. Not that the gods physically ate any of it, of course. The priests handled that part afterwards, very generously, as divine leftovers. It was a clever system. Feed the gods, feed yourself, keep the cosmic balance. The temple was the beating heart of the local economy, and the only place where your taxes occasionally came back to you, in disguise as charity. Now, while all this was happening at the village level, up in the palaces of Thebes or Memphis, Pharaoh's administrators were busy pretending to control everything. They issued decrees, set quotas, and sent out orders written on papyrus, a miracle material, by the way, made from reeds of the Nile, pressed, dried, and sliced thin. It was Egypt's greatest export before Cleopatra's eyeliner. The scribes would record everything in precise columns, using a mix of hieratic and hieroglyphic script. Their handwriting was gorgeous, and nearly unreadable to anyone but themselves, which probably helped when creative accounting was involved.
Let's not forget the vizier, the pharaoh's right hand, basically the ancient version of a prime minister. The vizier oversaw taxation, law, agriculture, architecture, everything. He was the link between divine ruler and mortal chaos. If a famine broke out or a canal burst, guess who got blamed first? His office was a labyrinth of scribes, messengers, and terrified assistants. And while the pharaoh's word was law, it was the vizier's pen that made it real. There's an old saying carved in a tomb that could sum up Egyptian administration perfectly. Do not trust a scribe who smiles too much. Profound advice. Now, let's talk about punishment, the unpleasant side of the system. If you tried to dodge taxes, falsify weights, or hide grain, the state took it personally. Punishments ranged from fines and public beatings to imprisonment in work camps. Sometimes officials were punished too, publicly whipped or demoted. Egypt's justice system had a flair for spectacle. But here's the twist. They also believed justice followed you into the afterlife. Your heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If it was heavy with lies or greed, you'd be devoured by Amet, the crocodile-lion-hippo monster who ate sinful souls for breakfast. So theoretically, even corrupt scribes faced cosmic consequences. Whether that helped comfort the starving farmers, well, probably not much. Now, let's drift toward evening again. A farmer finishes his last task of the day, repairing a levee, feeding his donkey, whispering a prayer to Osiris as the sun bleeds red over the fields. In the distance, temple bells sound softly. The air cools, families gather, eating simple meals, bread, beans, maybe a bit of fish. Children fall asleep beside the hearth. The world feels calm again. The taxes can wait until morning. Because even in ancient Egypt, despite the bureaucracy, despite the floods, despite the divine paperwork of life, there was rhythm, community, and hope. The same Nile that drowned your fields one year would bless them the next. The same scribes who tallied your debts might record your name in a prayer scroll someday. It was all one endless cycle: work, worry, worship, rest, flowing like the river itself. And maybe that's why Egypt endured for so long. Not because of pharaohs or pyramids or armies, but because ordinary people, year after year, chose to keep going. In our next and final part, we'll drift gently into Part 4, Death, Burial, and the Afterlife, the farmer's final journey, where the same man who spent his life sweating under the sun prepares to meet the gods, still slightly worried someone might tax him on the way.
So, you've woken up before sunrise, fed your ox, hauled your water, maybe insulted the scribe under your breath for good measure, and now, what's next in the thrilling saga of your Egyptian farmer life? Well, congratulations! You've made it to what passes for mid-morning. The sun is now a molten coin over the horizon, and it's about to cook you medium well. Most farmers at this point would have already been knee-deep in the Nile mud, either attending to crops or repairing irrigation channels. Egypt was basically one big irrigation project with a desert attached, and while that might sound grand, for the average farmer, it meant constant labor just to keep water flowing where it should. Canals silted up, mud walls collapsed, sometimes crocodiles decided they owned the ditch now. The day-to-day work wasn't heroic, it was muddy, repetitive, and crucial. When the Nile flood receded, the soil left behind was rich, dark, and sticky as wet clay, perfect for growing barley, emmer wheat, lentils, and flax. Farmers sowed seeds by hand while their oxen trampled them into the ground. An elegant system if you ignored the heat, the flies, and the occasional divine plague. And about those flies, they were everywhere. They didn't care that you were a hard-working citizen of the two lands. They didn't care that your pharaoh was technically a living god. They just cared that you were sweaty, covered in mud, and probably smelled like fermented fish and onions, which, by the way, you did. Still, Egyptian farmers managed. They wrapped linen around their heads, smeared animal fat on their skin to keep the bugs away, sort of, and got on with it. Because really, what choice did they have? Let's float gently to lunchtime. If you're picturing a relaxing midday break, maybe under a palm tree with a jug of cold water, stop. This isn't a resort. This is the Old Kingdom. Lunch, for most farmers, was whatever they could carry into the fields, often a hunk of bread, a few onions, and maybe a small piece of dried fish if it was a good day. Beer was a staple too, but not the fun kind. Egyptian beer was thick, grainy, and tasted a bit like watery oatmeal, but it did the job of hydrating and dulling the taste of everything else. Eating while standing or squatting in the shade of your ox was totally normal. It wasn't glamorous, but at least it was fuel. Sometimes farmers sang work songs to keep rhythm, little chants about the gods, about the Nile, or about how much they hated taxes. The songs weren't written down, but it's safe to assume most were, in tone, something like, "O great Osiris, may the scribe step in cow dung today." By midday, you'd be drenched in sweat. Your linen kilt stuck to your legs. The river shimmered temptingly in the distance, but you didn't just jump in. Because, well, crocodiles. And also, your overseer would probably notice your lack of productivity. The divine bureaucracy, gods, pharaohs, and grain. Every grain that sprouted from the soil technically belonged to the gods, or at least that's what the priests said, which conveniently meant it belonged to the temple, which conveniently meant it belonged to the pharaoh, who then redistributed it after taking a generous portion, of course. Farmers were expected to deliver a share of their crops as tax, and that share could be as high as 1/3 of everything they grew. The government didn't do flexible payment plans. If you failed to deliver, scribes would note it down, soldiers would show up, and you might lose your livestock or even your freedom. But let's be honest, the average Egyptian didn't think too hard about rebelling. Pharaoh was the intermediary between people and gods, and in a deeply religious world, that's like saying he was the Wi-Fi router for divine favor. You didn't mess with that. So farmers prayed for good floods, for gentle weather, and for tax collectors to forget where they lived. They offered small sacrifices, bits of grain, a fish, a carved figurine, to deities like Hapi, god of the Nile, or Renenutet, goddess of harvest. Sometimes, after a particularly good season, the village would hold a feast. There'd be beer, music, maybe even a roast goose if someone knew the right temple official. Those were the good nights. Laughter, drums, a breeze off the Nile, but mostly it was work, day after day, sun after sun. Let's drift to evening. As the light faded and the desert began to cool, the farmers returned home. Their houses were simple, mud brick walls, flat roofs, small courtyards. The floors were packed earth, swept smooth but never cleaned by modern standards. Chickens might be roosting in the corner, a goat might be tied to the wall. Children darted around barefoot, giggling and dusty. Dinner looked a lot like lunch. Bread, onions, lentils, beer. Maybe some dates for dessert if luck was kind. People sat on mats, talked softly, and let the heat drain from their bodies. If you looked up, the sky would be a black velvet sheet scattered with stars. Egyptians loved the night. It was when the world felt calm again. The day's labor was done, the fields glowed faintly under the moon, and for a few hours, life was peaceful. Sometimes a father might tell stories about gods sailing the sky, about pharaohs fighting chaos, or about the time his neighbor's donkey accidentally ate the overseer's barley. The children would laugh, then yawn, and then curl up to sleep on woven mats, while the adults talked softly about the flood, the harvest, or the price of fish. No electricity, no screens, just the sound of the river, the whisper of reeds, and maybe the occasional mosquito dive-bombing your ear. When the Nile people slept, they didn't just rest. They believed dreams were messages from the divine. If you dreamed of clear water, that was good. If you dreamed of crocodiles, well, you might want to apologize to someone soon. People often slept with amulets nearby, tiny carvings of scarabs, ankhs, or protective gods like Bes, the squat, cheerful deity who scared off evil spirits. And honestly, after a day spent knee-deep in mud and bureaucracy, having a short, ugly god guard your dreams seemed like a reasonable arrangement. Sleep came early. The day's exhaustion saw to that. There were no lamps burning through the night. Oil was precious. Just moonlight filtering through the doorway, the soft snoring of family members, and the distant call of night birds over the fields. Life for an Egyptian farmer was simple, cyclical, and astonishingly stable. Dynasties rose and fell, gods changed names, temples expanded, but the farmers, they just kept planting, harvesting, and surviving. For 3,000 years, through every twist of history, that rhythm barely changed. The pharaohs might have their pyramids, the priests might have their gold, But it was the farmers, the sunburned, mud-streaked, quietly stubborn majority who kept Egypt alive.
So, the day's work is done, the fields are quiet, the oxen are chewing lazily, and the Nile hums its eternal lullaby. Inside the small mud-brick home of our Egyptian farmer, another kind of life continues, slower, smaller, and somehow just as fascinating. Let's start with the family. Most Egyptian farmers lived in close-knit households, which were less nuclear family and more everyone who can fit under this roof without stepping on a chicken. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes cousins all shared the same living space. Privacy was a foreign concept. You didn't need a bedroom door because there were no doors to begin with. A woven reed curtain was luxury enough. The house itself was, let's say, functional. Mud brick walls, flat roof, sometimes used for sleeping during hot nights, and floors that doubled as both dining area and play space. The air smelled faintly of smoke, grain dust, and sweat. You didn't own much, maybe a few clay pots, a grinding stone, a mat, and, if you were lucky, a small wooden chest for clothes. But make no mistake, these homes were full of life. Children chased each other in circles, mothers baked bread in clay ovens called tannours, fathers mended tools or sharpened sickles, goats bleated, hens squawked, someone's baby cried, and the family dog snored in the corner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. Let's drift over to marriage, ancient style. Egyptian marriages were, by and large, practical. Love wasn't irrelevant, it just came second to survival. A good marriage was one that produced children, especially sons. Farmers needed labor, and nothing said family success like having enough kids to plow, sow, and carry water without hiring help. That said, the Egyptians weren't cold-hearted. They wrote love poems, some of them surprisingly tender and occasionally borderline flirtatious. One popular line goes something like, "My heart flutters at your voice, my limbs tremble at your laughter." Not bad for a guy whose primary occupation was convincing donkeys to behave. Marriages were informal by modern standards. There was no big ceremony, no priest's blessing required. A man and woman simply agreed to live together, sometimes after the man provided a small dowry. Divorce? Also simple. You could separate, divide property, and move on. Egyptians were practical like that, maybe too tired for long legal disputes. Children, the real workforce. Now, in case you're imagining carefree children skipping by the riverbank, let's correct that image. Most kids began helping with chores as soon as they could walk straight. Fetching water, collecting dung for fuel, chasing geese, grinding grain, all perfectly acceptable childhood activities. Formal education? Reserved for the elite. If you were lucky enough to be the son of a scribe or priest, you might attend a small school where your teacher hit you with a stick until you could copy hieroglyphs properly. For everyone else, education happened in the field, learning to sow, reap, and not annoy your overseer. Still, childhood wasn't entirely grim. There were toys, little carved animals, balls made of rags, and even board games like Senet, a sort of ancient Egyptian cross between checkers and luck-based suffering. Kids also swam, played pretend, and occasionally probably got yelled at for losing the goat again. Health and hygiene. Tricky business. The Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness, which is impressive considering they lived in mud. Farmers bathed daily in the Nile when possible, hopefully upstream from the cows, rubbed themselves with oils and wore fresh linen when they could afford it. Still, let's be honest, this was a world without soap, plumbing, or antibiotics. Parasites were a given. Tooth decay was rampant.
All that sand in their bread didn't help. Common ailments included everything from eye infections to intestinal worms. And yet, somehow, people lived long enough to raise families and complain about taxes. For small wounds and fevers, they had remedies: honey, which was antibacterial, herbs, and prayers. Lots of prayers. Medicine was always part science, part magic. If you had a toothache, someone might prescribe chewing herbs or reciting a spell about a god's aching jaw. Best to do both, just in case. Let's float to evening rituals, home edition. As night settled again over the Nile Valley, the family gathered for dinner. Bread, lentils, onions, maybe fish if someone caught one. Beer, as always, was the drink of choice. It wasn't just hydration, it was comfort, community, and probably a coping mechanism for the endless monotony of farm life. After dinner, families might talk softly or sit in silence. Some sang hymns to the gods. Others mended clothes by firelight. The sound of grinding stones, distant frogs, and an occasional cow lowing in the dark filled the air. Candles? Not exactly. Oil lamps provided faint flickers, casting long shadows on the mud brick walls. In that dim glow, you might see the family's small shrine, a carved image of a household deity like Bess or Taweret. Offerings of flowers, bread, or tiny figurines sat there, humble but sincere. Religion, for the farmer, wasn't a grand temple affair. It was personal, woven into every part of daily life. You didn't pray to change the world. You prayed for tomorrow's harvest not to fail, for your child's fever to break, for your ox to stop limping.
Time in ancient Egypt wasn't measured by clocks. It was measured by the Nile. Its flood, its retreat, its renewal. Everything depended on that slow, predictable breathing of the river. The year divided into 3 main seasons: Akhet, the inundation, the flood season; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. During Akhet, the fields vanished underwater. There was little farming to do, so people repaired tools, made pottery, fished, and worked on state projects, like building pyramids or temples. Not exactly vacation, but a change of pace. Peret was for planting, the busy, hopeful time. Farmers watched the skies, prayed for steady weather, and coaxed green life out of the wet soil. Then came Shemu, the exhausting harvest. Long days, short tempers, and everyone covered in dust and grain. When the last sheaf was bundled and the tax grain carted off, the village would feast. One night of relief before the cycle began again. It was a life so regular, so predictable, it could almost lull you to sleep. Which, honestly, is kind of the point here.
So, we've made it through the work, the family, and the daily grind of our ancient Egyptian farmer's life. But before you drift off entirely, let's talk about the small bursts of color that broke the monotony, the festivals, the little superstitions, and eventually, the comforting certainty that death wasn't the end. Because despite the heat, the hunger, and the back pain, these people knew how to celebrate. Festivals, the farmer's holiday calendar. Imagine it's the middle of Peret, the growing season. You've been hoeing the fields for weeks, your back feels like a wooden beam, and your sandals have disintegrated again. Then, word comes down the river. It's the Feast of Opet in Thebes. The gods are on parade. Now, unless you lived near Thebes or Memphis, you probably wouldn't go yourself. Farmers couldn't just abandon their fields for a city party. But even the smallest village marked the great festivals in some way. There would be music, food, dancing, and yes, plenty of beer. Egyptians were not known for moderation. Festivals were more than fun. They were social glue. You'd catch up with neighbors, gossip about who owed who grain, and maybe flirt behind the granary if the overseer wasn't looking. Priests marched with images of the gods, people shouted blessings, and someone inevitably passed out in the dust by noon. Every season had a divine excuse for a feast. The flooding Nile meant offerings to Hapi, the river god. Planting time brought thanks to Osiris, who symbolized rebirth. And harvest time? That was for Hathor, the goddess of joy, music, and beauty. Think of her as the patron saint of "we survived another year." If you've ever wondered why ancient Egyptian art shows so many people holding lotus flowers and smiling, this was the moment. For one day, life wasn't about mud and taxes. It was about dancing, laughing, and pretending the gods were actually listening. Village gossip, the eternal Egyptian sport. When you live in a small farming village where everyone knows everyone, gossip becomes a national pastime. There were no newspapers, no TikTok, no breaking news, so people filled the void with speculation, rumors, and mild slander. Who got caught watering his fields early? Who borrowed someone else's donkey again? Who made eyes at the temple singer? The Nile carried secrets faster than the current itself. Some of this gossip even made it onto papyrus. Ancient letters and court records survived that read like soap operas. People accusing their neighbors of stealing linen, or spreading rumors, or pretending their grain measure was smaller than it really was. Spoiler: everyone cheated on grain measures. Still, gossip wasn't just malice. It was entertainment. When the evenings were long and the lamps dim, telling stories about the people down the street was the ancient equivalent of Netflix. Faith in the everyday. Now, religion wasn't something separate from life. It was life. The ancient Egyptian farmer didn't think of faith as a Sunday activity. It was embedded in every breath, every harvest, every loaf of bread. You prayed before plowing. You muttered a blessing before drinking. You thanked the gods when your child stopped coughing. The divine was everywhere, in the river, the sun, the cattle, the grain. There wasn't one god, but hundreds. Each had a purpose, a quirk, a mood. Ra guided the sun. Osiris oversaw rebirth. Anubis took care of the dead. Bastet, the cat goddess, protected your home, and probably your actual cats. In the corner of your modest house sat a small household shrine. Maybe just a lump of clay shaped into the god Bes, protector of families, with a goofy grin and lion mane. You might place a flower, a bit of bread, or a tiny jug of beer there before bed, because you never knew when a god might be listening. And yes, Egyptians believed the gods were watching, but not in a terrifying, fire and brimstone way, more like concerned neighbors keeping an eye on you. The universe to them had rules, and if you lived rightly, the gods would keep the Nile flowing and the locusts away. Now we reach the part where the ancient Egyptians truly stood apart, because unlike most people in history, they weren't afraid of death. They didn't see it as an end, just a change of address. To them, death was another phase of the cycle. Just as the Nile flooded, receded, and returned, so did life. When you died, your Ka, spirit, would leave the body, but you weren't gone. You'd travel through the underworld, pass some rather bureaucratic tests, heart weight against a feather, that sort of thing, and then, if all went well, you'd be granted eternal life in the field of reeds. And the field of reeds, as imagined by farmers, looked a lot like Egypt. Fields, rivers, cattle, sunshine, just without the taxes and back pain. So the farmer's goal wasn't to escape the toil of earth. It was to earn an afterlife where the work was lighter, the beer never ran out, and the overseer had mysteriously vanished. To secure that, you'd try to live honestly, speak kindly, give offerings, and not steal your neighbor's goat. You might also save up for a modest coffin, some amulets, and a painted shroud. If you couldn't afford a tomb, you'd settle for a clay jar buried in a communal graveyard. Either way, you'd make sure your name was remembered.
That was the key. Immortality came from memory. And in that sense, the ancient Egyptian farmer achieved something profound. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about them. Their tools, their homes, even their bread loaves survived under the desert sand. They dreamed of eternity, and somehow they got it. As the stars rose above the dark river, our farmer's world shrank again to the size of a small courtyard. A flickering lamp, the sound of insects, the steady breath of sleeping children. The day's noise faded into the hum of the night, eternal, peaceful, and ancient. He might look up once more before lying down on his woven mat. The constellations hadn't changed for thousands of years. Orion, or Sa as he knew him, rose over the horizon, leading the way for Osiris. The same stars his ancestors prayed under, and their ancestors before them. The river glimmered faintly in the distance. Tomorrow would bring more of the same work, the same sun, the same slow, patient rhythm of a world built on mud and memory. But in that sameness was stability, comfort, the kind of peace that only comes from knowing your place in the order of things. Humble but essential. So he closed his eyes, listening to the river's lullaby. And the Nile, as it always did, carried the promise of another dawn. So now let's drift quietly forward, thousands of years later, to the age of archaeology, when the silence of the Egyptian farmer's world was broken for the first time in millennia. It's strange to think that the man who spent his life coaxing grain from the Nile's mud never imagined people in distant centuries would one day dig through that same mud looking for traces of him. But they did. And what they found was not gold or jewels or grand monuments, though Egypt certainly has plenty of those. No, what they found were the quiet leftovers of daily life. A wooden hoe, a clay bowl, a half-crushed loaf of bread. Things that whispered, softly but clearly, we were here too. The archaeologist's treasure. Ordinary things. When early explorers and scholars came to Egypt, they were of course obsessed with pharaohs, the pyramids, the temples, the tombs. But as excavations spread beyond royal sites, they began uncovering villages like Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs, or Kahun, a planned town from the Middle Kingdom. And in those forgotten homes, they found something unexpected: normal life. There were little children's dolls made from sticks and cloth, half-written letters complaining about missing wages, household shrines, cooking pots, even graffiti scratched onto limestone walls that read, roughly translated, "The work was bad today." One man, many centuries ago, scribbled an entire list of his household goods before moving house. It included things like one bed frame, one stool, one broken jar. Imagine an ancient moving checklist surviving 3,500 years. That's what history leaves behind. Not the thunder of kings, but the whispers of the people who kept them alive. The writing that never slept. Writing in ancient Egypt was both magical and mundane. Most farmers couldn't read or write. Literacy was rare, the domain of scribes. But that didn't mean they were excluded from the written world. Their lives were recorded about them, not by them. A tax collector would note the number of cattle in a household. A priest might record who brought offerings. A foreman might list who showed up late for work on the irrigation canal. And yes, those lists survive too. You can still read one farmer's complaint from around 1200 BCE. He accuses the local guards of stealing his donkey. His phrasing is surprisingly modern. "I have been wronged, and I will not be silent." The guards apparently were unimpressed. It's the kind of thing that reminds us people have always been people. Bureaucrats were lazy, neighbors quarreled, families loved, lost, and worried. Nothing really changes, only the tools we use to complain about it. The art that told their story. Of course, when most people think of Egypt, they think of art, those timeless paintings in flat colors, profile faces, perfect poses. What's less known is that many of those paintings weren't about pharaohs at all. In tombs belonging to middle-ranking officials and even wealthy farmers, we see vivid depictions of everyday labor. Plowing, sowing, reaping, herding, fishing, scene after scene of rural life frozen in time. One wall might show a man feeding oxen, another a woman brewing beer. Musicians play harps, dancers clap hands. It's not grandeur, it's gratitude. These images were offerings to eternity, meant to remind the gods, and perhaps the farmers themselves, that work had dignity. You can still see them today, their pigments miraculously bright after 3,000 years. Russet, ochre, teal, saffron, colors of the land itself. And it's almost funny in a cosmic way. Pharaohs built entire stone mountains to be remembered, but it's the farmers' brushstrokes that feel most alive. What science knows, and what it still guesses. Modern archaeology, with all its gadgets and precision, has filled in much of what those ancient farmers left unsaid. From bones and pollen, we know what they ate, mostly bread, beans, onions, dates, and fish. Occasionally meat, if the gods were feeling generous. From skeletal remains, we know the toll of their labor: worn joints, cracked vertebrae, arthritis by age 30. Their teeth tell stories too. Ground grain was full of sand and grit, so by middle age most had teeth filed down to the roots. Imagine chewing your daily bread, knowing it was literally grinding your teeth away. Yet, with all that hardship, they lived with purpose. The art of farming was not just survival, it was a relationship with the divine. To care for the Nile was to care for Egypt. And when the annual flood came, it wasn't a disaster, it was rebirth. The farmer's faith in the river's rhythm was deeper than science. It was spiritual geometry. The eternal rhythm. Sometimes, when archaeologists excavate an ancient house, they find the remains of footprints baked into the floor, impressions left when the mud was still wet. You can almost imagine the moment. A farmer smoothing the plaster, stepping back, maybe calling his wife to look at the new room. Then the years piled on. Sand drifted in. The house fell. The footprints stayed. That, in a way, is Egypt's story, an entire civilization imprinted on time, layer by layer. And beneath the pharaohs, beneath the temples, the heartbeat was always the same: the farmer, the field, the Nile. It's tempting to see these people as simple or primitive, but they managed something modern life rarely offers: balance. They lived within the limits of nature, trusted its cycles, and built a culture so stable that it lasted longer than most of recorded history combined. When you step back, it's humbling. The world has changed: cars, satellites, skyscrapers, yet the basic truth remains. Food comes from the earth, and someone, somewhere, still wakes up before dawn to pull it from the soil. A last look before sleep. So let's imagine one last evening, thousands of years ago. The air smells of river clay and smoke. The horizon glows faintly orange. A man stands outside his house, leaning on his staff, watching the water shimmer. He doesn't know his name will be lost. He doesn't know strangers from other worlds will one day dig through that same mud looking for traces of him. He only knows that tomorrow the sun will rise again and he will follow it, as his father did and his father before him. His world was small, but it was whole. And maybe that's enough. The river flows, the reeds whisper, and somewhere in the dark, the gods, or perhaps just their memory of them, keep watch. Sleep well, traveler of time. The Nile never stops flowing.
The desert night has fallen again. The stars above the Nile gleam like cold embers, the same ones that shone above those farmers so many thousands of years ago. If you listen closely, if you let the noise of the modern world fade for a moment, you can almost hear it. The soft lap of the river, the murmur of reeds, the hush of eternity breathing through sand. The memory beneath our feet. Every handful of earth we touch has been touched before. Somewhere beneath the soil lies a grain of dust that was once part of a field plowed by an Egyptian farmer, his sweat mixing with the same water that still flows through the Nile today. Time, you see, doesn't destroy everything. It remembers. Not in names or monuments. Those crumble, but in the rhythm, the pattern, the quiet continuation of things that matter. When a farmer in modern Egypt bends over his field at dawn, the gesture is the same. The sun still burns in the same way. The air still tastes of mud and water and labor. Civilizations may rise, gods may fall, but the hand that sows, that never changes. The weight of small lives. We often think history is built by heroes, by kings, conquerors, and monuments of stone. But if you could weigh all their glory against the billions of quiet lives that tilled, cooked, built, and prayed, you'd find the scales tipped the other way. Those unknown men and women, they were the true architects of eternity. They didn't write history, they lived it, one sunrise at a time. And perhaps in their smallness, they achieved what we still chase: peace in routine, faith in tomorrow, and belonging to something larger than ourselves. The river and the world. Stand beside any river long enough and you begin to understand the Nile. It moves endlessly, yet it never hurries. It gives, and it takes. It carves civilizations, feeds millions, and then slips quietly away, asking for nothing in return. Maybe that's the lesson Egypt left for us: to live like a river, steady, generous, and humble, to keep flowing even when no one remembers where you began. The last image. So picture it one last time. The moon reflected in dark water, a field shimmering with the promise of dawn. Somewhere out there, a man rises from his reed mat, stretches, and steps barefoot into the cool earth. He lifts a handful of soil, dark and wet, and smiles. He doesn't know why, but he feels a kind of eternity in his hands. The air is silent, except for the gentle rush of the river, the same river that will outlive us all. And as he walks toward the fields, the first light touches the horizon, spilling gold across the valley. It looks almost like a memory waking up. So that's where we'll leave them tonight, the farmers of the Nile. Their names are gone, their houses long turned to dust, but their rhythm, That calm, stubborn rhythm of sunrise and soil still hums beneath the world. Maybe that's why Egypt never truly feels ancient. Because somewhere, a plow still cuts through damp earth. Somewhere, a mother still kneads bread by a clay oven, humming the same tune her ancestors once did. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. If your eyes are still open, congratulations, you've outlasted a civilization. And if they're not, well, that's okay too. Sleep well, travelers of time. We'll meet again, somewhere along another forgotten river. Good night.